Welcome to the Writing 2 presentation, Researching Local Issues. This particular presentation isn't going to directly use the How to Write Anything book. It's going to take ideas and principles from that book and apply them to local issues. But I find kind of going back and forth there gets a little bit troublesome if you're trying to follow the PowerPoint slide presentation at home or wherever you're at. What I recommend is you go back through chapter 38 in How to Write Anything and just kind of review some research basics. Again, this is Writing 2 and you should have learned about those things in Writing 1, so we're going to apply those principles to local issues and have some fun doing that. Researching local information can be a lot of fun, and one of the most important things about researching local information, it can help you see how some of the different ideas and problems and issues that you might be writing about in some of your different classes, you can see how those really affect real local people, people that you might know about, people that you might be able to relate to, information about where you've lived or places that you're interested in. For a few minutes then, we'll introduce you to the basics of local research. The first thing that you need to think about is the term demographics. And what this means is the data or information that can help describe the characteristics of a population. That's a very basic definition. What that means is you're going to look for statistics that help you better describe the people in the area you're researching. Let's look at an example real quick. Maybe you're interested in writing about how our area in Marshall County could better serve the needs of an elderly population, and you need to define and look up how elderly is described and what actual ages that means. But you can find some demographics on elderly people of a certain age in Marshall County, what their income level is, if they're predominantly male or female, maybe how many of them have disabilities or other mobility issues, even their stances on different social issues or activities. Another example of using demographics might be to look at children in a specific area and finding out, well, how many of them are living in poverty? How many of them are enrolled in school currently? And you'd think it would be all of them, but often a percentage of them are not. You can also ask, well, do they predominantly live in rural areas or more urban areas? What about the schools that they're attending? You can start doing information about that based on the demographics and look and say, wow, well, in this area where the income level is a lot higher, I can look and find that the school is also rated more highly and these children are clearly getting a better education. We can find demographics about local populations in various places. One place that's really great for that is a U.S. Census, and we have a whole entire lesson on how to use the Census website and how that works in that information. And I encourage you to spend some time looking around on the Census website and experimenting and playing with that as part of that lesson. A fairly obvious place to do local research is through the local news media, but many students just simply overlook this because it's so predominant. Many people don't watch their nightly news or listen to local radio news reports, and so they don't even think to look in those places. Sometimes they watch those news reports every night, but would never think of that as a source for a research paper. So I'm telling you that's a good place to look. Often news reporting will bring in statistics that they found in other places, and sometimes they'll even cite the sources so you can go find those sources. Local news stories often provide local examples of problems as well. Local news media can also help introduce you to local experts or even local organizations that you could also go hunt down and get more research from them. As such, the local news media can be a really valuable place to do some research. You do have to be a little bit careful. Often local news media, especially in smaller areas, the reporting can be a little bit rough. Sometimes the reporting will not be accurate, and sometimes those stories will end up getting changed. Sometimes they won't. I can tell you this is not meant to be insulting or a slap on local news media, but as someone who has contributed to local news media and who knows many of the people involved with that, I know they work very hard and they try to do a good job, but they're going to miss a few things here and there. So you do want to make sure that whatever you use out of the local news media, if you can, you fact check or you go try to find the resource that they use to get that information as much as possible. Some local media that might have a little bit more in the way of resources, you have to be careful with them because they'll do various updates of their news stories on their website. They might have an initial report because they want to get that story out there as soon as they possibly can and maybe beat out some competition. But the problem is sometimes that reporting won't be very accurate. It'll be missing key ideas or definitions of terms. It might miss some obvious things that they want to report. And so they'll go back and update those same news stories several times. And that's good that they're making them better, but that can be frustrating for you as a student because maybe something you read the first time will have changed the next time around. As you're doing these papers, I encourage you to use local news media, but just have a few precautions in mind. Another good place for local information is through government or other agency websites. So, for example, the state of Indiana has a pretty good website. The Indiana State Police publishes data and statistics on crime and various other things. You can find a lot of good information there. A lot of students have taken advantage of that. And also look at local organizations or even national organizations with local chapters that would have information about a specific group of people or a specific issue. If you're doing a paper about the problem of homelessness, specifically in South Bend, well, then maybe the South Bend Center for the Homeless or the Ray Kroc Center or some of these other places that deal with the homeless population, they've done a ton of research. Oftentimes, in order to get funded, they need to go out and gather a lot of research that shows that they need the funding. And as a result, they'll have a lot of good information that with a little digging or by contacting them, you can get a hold of that information too. And suddenly you've got some amazing information to use in your research paper. You can also look for local experts and officials. Sometimes they'll get cited in news stories or they'll be affiliated with these organizations that we just talked about. You might also ask people who have lived in an area for a long time or who have some experience to point you in the direction of some of these local experts. I've only lived in this Plymouth Marshall County area for 4 or 5 years now, but just as part of the different things I volunteer for and my own interests, I've established a pretty good network of people. And oftentimes, if you have questions about something you're researching in this particular area or maybe Stark County, I'll be able to point you in the right direction. And many other professors or people that you know who might be in professional careers would be able to help you with that too. I know some of you might be doing your research on areas outside of our local area here, maybe where you grew up. You might know some people, but you might need some help with that. Some of you are doing larger areas, maybe more urban areas too. And again, I'm always happy to help you look up and find those people. Over the years of teaching this and over the years of doing my own research, often I'm able to have a pretty good idea on how to contact them and find people that can help you. And my experience is that often these local experts and officials are more than happy to help college students who are writing. They want people to be interested in the same things that they're interested in. They might want people who can help spread the words about things that they view as problems. So they're usually really happy to help you and keep in correspondence with you. When you're writing about issues that affect your local populations or populations of specific areas, you won't always find a whole lot of information that directly links the two. In other words, you may not find information specifically about that problem in your county in a way that explores it academically and brings in a lot of good, solid, scholarly research. That's your job. That's one of the reasons that we professors love to see you doing that, because it shows you're able to tie two different ideas together and see how these ideas and theories and heavy scholarly research do affect a specific group of people in a specific area, specific communities. And that's a real skill to develop, is to show how two things relate to each other. So you should know when you go to start your scholarly heavy research about these papers that, again, you're not necessarily going to find huge amounts on a specific problem that relates to a specific area that you're going to write about. But you can find lots of good information about the problem or the issue or the situation or the idea in general. You should make sure that whatever information you find is appropriate for the area you're talking about. So while it may not specifically reference Marshall County or Stark County or Southern Indiana or Chicago or South Bend or wherever you're writing about, you'll want to make sure that your research could at least be used to describe the issue as it exists in that area. For example, if you're writing about ways to improve education in local schools, well, then the information and academic scholarly research you find about education should probably at least apply to the US and maybe even something more specifically like rural areas. But you definitely shouldn't be bringing in research about education systems in completely different cultures. So, for example, if you're finding great information about how education is done in China or in India, well, that's probably really fascinating research, but we're in a very different culture. We have different schools and education systems set up. So, you may not want to spend a whole lot of time or any time on that. You want to find Western education system information. Even if you're comparing the two types of education, maybe a more Eastern approach versus a more Western approach, you don't want to spend so much time doing that your paper is completely unrealistic and impractical. One really good practical way of looking at this is thinking that you're going to use your scholarly research and your academic research to come up with these ideas and theories and descriptions of issues, and then you're going to use your local data and local examples to show how those scholarly pieces of research apply and have a very practical result in a local area, or could possibly provide a good solution. And those two things are going to synthesize, we'll use that term, they're going to work together to create an all new idea that supports your own ideas. To show how scholarly research and local research can be used and combined together to examine local issues and to write about local problems or local situations, we're going to run through a couple of different examples. And I've invented two different students and two different approaches. I find that students usually do fall into one of these two approaches. You may find yourself in one of these two or somewhere in between. So we're going to use the examples of George and Mavis. George is starting out having already observed a need, and he has seen this need around him. He knows that children in Stark County need some better educational opportunities, and he knows there's a lot of poverty in Stark County, and he suspects that probably that has something to do with some of the educational issues. I should note that as we start this example, these things may or may not actually be true, but often students want to investigate things like this. So I'm using these examples, and you'd have to find out, do your own research to see how true these are. But these are good examples for our class. So as George starts this research project, he knows he wants to write about education and poverty in Stark County. He isn't really aware of any groups that are trying to address this problem, but he wants to investigate and research about this and write about it. On the other hand, we have Mavis, and Mavis has some relatives in Chicago. Maybe she's from Chicago, spent some time there. As a result, maybe her cousins or she herself participated in some local sports leagues. And these are public sports leagues that may not have anything to do with actual schools. And she's seen firsthand the value that they have and that they've made a difference in children's lives, maybe made a difference in her or cousins' lives. And so she knows, wow, well, there's a local issue paper to be done there. So she's going to start off already knowing of some of these organizations, and she might know some of the basics on what problems they address, but that's really what she's going to look for. And because she's aware of these public sports leagues and she has their brochures around or knows where their websites are, she already knows of the names of these leagues, and she knows why they exist, the different reasons that they have started these leagues. One might be to help children find positive activities to fill their time rather than getting into negative activities, crime, drugs, gangs, things like that. Also, they exist, number two, to help children gain leadership and teamwork skills. And then number three, they might exist to help children become more active and exercise rather than just sit around watching TV or playing video games. So she knows that these organizations do good work and that they exist for these several different reasons. She knows this as she starts beginning the rest of her research. Continuing on with her example of George, remember George is the student who decided he wanted to do something having to do with education or maybe poverty in Stark County. George wanted to find some good scholarly research, so he started looking on EBSCOhost, and he thought, I think helping people out of poverty, especially helping children get out of poverty when they're adults, education's a big part of that. So he started using EBSCOhost or possibly Gale, Cengage, other academic scholarly periodical research databases to look for information and articles about the importance of education for children who want to rise above poverty or get jobs that pay better than working class jobs, jobs that might pay around minimum wage without benefits, health insurance, things like that. He also read an article in our Norton Field Guide, and our Norton Field Guide has some excellent articles. You'd be surprised how many great articles are just in there waiting for you to get ideas for something you could write about. One that many students have found helpful is Class in America 2003 by Gregory Mancios, and that's on page 697. And that has a lot of good information and good ideas that George can use, and really many of you could probably use too in your own research and writing. And George found in that article all kinds of information that applies to his project. The article talks about the relationship between inadequate education and lower social class, and about how it's difficult for people to move into a higher social class without getting that really good education, but that really good education usually isn't available or provided for people in working class or poverty or even many middle class societies. So the article also has some good research and statistics and lots of good evidence, lots of good materials that George can use, and it's going to lead him to some other good resources as well. And that's important that you find good research that will lead you to other good research. Next, George found some demographics research about Stark County to show how many people could be considered poor working class. And again, you can find the definitions to these different things. You'll have to find out what the government definition or other people's definitions are. You'll want to make sure that you explain that in your own paper. But he did look that up. You can find income levels information in the US Census and other places. George looked and found this information, and while his information that he found didn't actually include information specifically about children in poverty, he could still use this research to show that a certain percentage of people in Stark County are in working class or poverty, different social classes, and then he could apply that focus to the kids. He also found education statistics for Stark County and found percentages of students who went on to college. You can also find how many dropped out of high school, things like that. He researched particular subjects and skills where students might need help and looked at how those relate to better job opportunities, other opportunities down the road. He can include info on how those particular skills and education can help them find specific jobs that will help them move up the social class ladder. He also could use the unemployment rate of high school dropouts and those who graduated high school but didn't go to college as well. He can find lots of good information about his particular county and use that to coordinate with information that he's finding about larger trends with unemployment and education levels and poverty, things like that. Having found the information that we have just talked about, George can then use that information about social class and education that he found in general to show that the two are related and that children from poor and working class families don't have the same education opportunities as children from middle class and especially upper class families. And as a result of that, they usually stay poor or working class. And again, this is a fairly established idea, fairly established fact that this is how things go. We know some exceptions of people who, of course, have moved up in social class, but the general trend is that people don't go anywhere. This is pretty well understood. You can find that research all over the place. George found that research, and then he brought in Stark County information to show that the general research does apply to Stark County. And he believes that that proves that there's a local need to help students gain better education opportunities. George could also decide to add more research in a variety of areas, particularly getting more specific about some of what he's already written to help bulk up and further add to his evidence as he's building a case about the local need. He might also decide to start looking for other research. At some point, he'll look for local groups who want to address the issue. And there are local groups who are trying to help with the education systems or help students have after school programs or other education opportunities. He's also going to look for some successful programs with the same type of target students, we would say. In other words, students in those social classes or education situations. He's going to look for examples of successful programs in other areas, and maybe that would be part of his solution that he would provide. He would say, well, there's some good programs going on over in Kosciuszko County or down in this county in southern Indiana, and we could do the same thing in Stark County. Looking at our second example of Mavis, remember whereas George knew of a general issue he wanted to write about and knew about a general area, but wasn't really sure where to go, Mavis is sort of on the other side of that. She knows what local organizations she wants to write about. Remember that she and her cousins had taken part in these public sports leagues in Chicago, and she knew that they were solving, a few different problems, issues with kids. So she wanted to do research about them, but of course, she also needs to find research to help her write about the local need aspect. So she can, of course, go to those organizations themselves and find research, and that's often a good idea. Find an organization you'd like to write about, and you can find some good information from them. They're usually quite happy to share that. And you can also use them to link to other pieces of research that these organizations have found that sort of guided their own thinking and guided their own actions. As we discussed earlier, Mavis already identified three issues or problems for her paper. Let's talk about the research she finds for those. She finds research for issue number one, talking about how it's very likely for inner city children who are poor or working class to get involved in drugs, gangs, and other criminal activities. She also includes some research about how many juvenile criminal offenders there are in Chicago, since that's her local area, plus research about how many teenagers in Chicago's inner city are unable to find part-time jobs to help earn money and spend their time positively. She's finding both specific local research about the teenagers in Chicago, but she is finding more general research about urban inner city children of certain social classes and that relationship with, again, drugs, gangs, and other criminal activity. For those of you who aren't doing urban areas, again, that's very likely and that's very common in more rural areas like our own, like Marshall County, Stark County, southern counties in Indiana. Again, very similar research. She also looked at a second issue that she's not really sure how to research. As you might recall, she knew that the second reason that these organizations started sports leagues is to help children develop leadership and teamwork skills. And she's not really sure how she's going to research that. So she does some just general Googling like most of us do and keeps looking around. She finally finds some articles where some credible authors, maybe some researchers, talk about the importance of athletic programs to help develop those skills in children and teens. That research isn't very specific, but she can still use it to show how these specific programs she knows of do help make a positive change. And again, athletics isn't the only type of after school or public league activity that organizations help out with. There are some great reading and creative writing organizations. I'd love to help you look into some of those if you're interested as well. But Mavis is working with public sports leagues, so we'll stay with that for now. And then issue number 3, she's looking at how these organizations help children stay active and live more active lifestyles. And how does that relate in? Well, she finds some scholarly research about the relationship between poor and working class families and childhood obesity. And again, you can find that information just in general. It doesn't always have to do with a specific area. She also finds information about how much activity and exercise children should be getting every day. And again, she can use that general information to show how these public sports leagues are helping children fulfill those goals.